So often you'll be given a plan if you have an exam coming up. So let's say that we want to do Year 11 mock revision. You'll sometimes be given a plan by your teacher, but sometimes you won't be given a plan and you will need to work out for yourself. So the first thing is to find out what it is you're actually going to be examined on. So my students, for example, in December will be examined on paper 1. And so the first thing to do would be to think, well, what's in paper 1? So in the scheme of work that we follow, we have P1, P2, all the way through to P7. And so P1 is conservation and dissipation of energy, P2 is energy transfer by heating, P3 is energy resources, P4 is electric circuits, P5 electricity in the home, P6 molecules and matter, P7 radioactivity. Okay, so this is how our scheme of work divides it up into these chapters. So the first thing would be for you to kind of go through and think from each of these chapters, what is it that really I needed to work on? So you could pause this video now and then have a look through your booklets or a revision guide or a textbook and think, what is it that you look at it and you think, oh gosh, I really remember doing that and not really understanding it, or I found that really difficult, or I didn't do very well in that test. And then I'm going to write down some things that my students have said that they needed to help with, or that I've identified as things that they need to do. Okay, so hopefully you have your own list, but let's go through how I would plan this. So first of all, P1, something that my students struggle with is the different stores, being able to identify the energy transfers that are happening and naming the stores that they are, and also the equations that are linked to them. So learning the equations off by heart and then calculations. Okay, so they need practice at those calculations. P2, the biggest thing is the specific heat capacity required practical. So the SHC RPA is something that is a big focus for P2. For P3 is the resources, the different energy resources and the advantages and disadvantages. So that could be something that we need to focus on. P4, so circuit questions, equations and calculations. The thing that I would also add to this though is that there is also 2 RPAs in the P4 chapter. P5, this is where AC and DC come into, and that can be a source of confusion. And then talking about electrical power is something that's important as well. P6, there's the density RPA, which is important. And there's also specific latent heat and internal energy are ideas that people often struggle with. And then P7, so alpha, beta, gamma, is something that is usually something that needs to be revised over and over. Half-life, and then if you're doing triple only, fission and fusion. So if you're not doing triple, you don't need to do that because that's not part of your it's not part of the chapter for you. But for triple students, fission and fusion is usually something they need to focus on. Then I try and get people to think about, well, what type of questions or what type of revision do we need to do? So they need to revise long answer questions. So these are the quality of written communication ones, usually 6 marks. Graph questions, so being able to interpret a graph, being able to read data from a graph, making a conclusion from a graph. So calculation questions are important as well. And then being able to give a method for an RPA. Now, they often ask you questions about required practicals that are to do with like the uncertainties and evaluating things and giving a conclusion, etc. However, being able to write a really clear numbered method is a really important thing, and there have been quite a few cases of 6-mark questions in exams where it's been, you know, give a method of how to measure whatever, and it's quite, if you revise it, it's quite an easy way to rack up the marks really, so it's worth doing that. So let's just make it really clear. The RPAs that are involved in paper 1. We have the specific heat capacity of a material, we have the resistance of a wire, we have the IV characteristics, and we have density. Now, if you do triple, there's also an RPA in P2, which is about thermal conductivity. Whoops, didn't really leave space. So thermal conductivity is another one if you do triple, but if you don't do triple, you don't need to know about that required practical. So the next thing that you want to do is obviously to think about how can you make this fit into the amount of time you've got between now and your exam. So the first thing is to think, when are your exams likely to be, if you don't necessarily have a date. So we know that our mock exams are going to be in the 2 weeks before the Christmas holidays. So I don't know the exact date at the moment of when the physics exam will be. So let's assume that in those 2 weeks, we don't want to still be revising the content because you'll have other exams at that point. So you want to have finished going through everything by the time the exam period starts, and then you've got time to do some last minute revision that goes over stuff that you've already covered. So let's have a think about that. So the first thing that you want to do is get some sort of kind of calendar. And so I've just looked in my planner so that I can find out the dates of the beginning of the week. So all we can think about is, what are the dates at the beginning of the week? So we've got the 2nd of November, Monday the 2nd of November, week beginning the 9th, 16th, 23rd, and then the week beginning the 30th. Now, this doesn't mean you have to do the revision on that date. It just means in the week that begins with Monday the 2nd of November. So I can see that we've got 5 full weeks until the exam period starts. Now I've got 7 topics, which makes it a bit more difficult to kind of think about, but what you can do is have a look at the topics and think which of these topics go together really nicely. So the first thing that I would say is P1 and P3 go together nicely. P1 and P3. And the reason for that is you've got energy stores and the equations, and then you've got energy resources. And in the energy resources, actually, we talk about it moving from one store to another quite a lot as well. So they really go together quite well. I would then put P2 and P6 together, because P2 is all about energy transfer by heating, and P6 is about molecules and matter, but there's lots of stuff to do with heating stuff up, changes of state and what have you, so they fit together quite nicely as well. Right, so we've now got P4, P5 and P7, and I've got 3 weeks left. What's always nice is to have a week where you are doing questions, okay? So try and make it so that you've got a week where you have an opportunity to do questions, and then if you do a question, think, oh, I still really don't understand that, you can go back to something that you've already covered, and it gives you time. If you plan to finish learning, like revising stuff for the first time just before your exam, you don't have the opportunity to go back over it and go back over it. So always try and make sure that you've given yourself a bit of time at the end to go back over and do some questions. So now I've got 2 weeks, I've got P4, P5 and P7. Now, you might be tempted to put P4 and P5 together because they're both about electricity. However, I would suggest not doing that. And the reason for that is that P4 has got 2 required practicals in it, and it's got several equations, quite a lot of different calculations, and I think that P4 people struggle with a little bit more than they do P5 and P7. So I would be tempted to do P4 on its own for a week, and then to do P5 and P7 on a different week separately. And that way, you know you've got enough time to make sure that you've covered everything. Now, you don't need to spend ages and ages and ages on each of these. You have, probably 8, 9, 10 different subjects that you need to revise for your mock exams. So there's not an expectation that you are doing hours and hours for each subject every night, because it's not sustainable. But you do need to make sure that what you're doing is going over this topic, and perhaps not over absolutely everything, maybe focusing on a specific thing. So spending time doing some calculations from P1, for example, spending time doing the advantages and disadvantages of the different resources for P3. And then when you've done those revision parts, it's useful to go back over them. So for P1, for example, equations, every week you should be testing yourself on the equations. So remember that there's the 23 equations app that you can get that checks over, and you can actually set that to test you on paper 1 equations as well. So you could make sure that you spend 10 minutes every day going through the equations for paper 1. Okay, so so what you do now with it will very much depend on kind of your confidence, the point that you're at. So things that you could do, you could make some sort of summary. If you make a summary, make sure that you keep it. Okay, because there's no point in writing out a new summary every time you revise. Otherwise, that is just a waste of your time. So you need to make sure that you are kind of keeping resources. So like flashcards, you could make as well, but you need to make sure you keep those so that you're not going over them over again. The thing you need to think about is, how are they going to assess you? They assess you by asking you questions and you answering them. So therefore, the thing that you need to practice is being asked questions and answering them. Okay, so the main thing is for you to practice answering questions, right? But use this where if you get a question wrong or you find it hard, go back to your summary and revise the stuff, and then go back again. And if you need help with anything, if you need some questions, then make sure that you ask your teacher.